The hallway outside Diane's apartment was silent, except for Sarah's thundering heartbeat. She stood frozen, the food basket slipping from her trembling fingers. Soup spilling across the cream tiles like blood. Before her stood Robert, her husband, with nothing but a towel around his waist, water still dripping from his shower. Behind him, Diane appeared in a silk robe, her face collapsing in horror when she saw Sarah. "You lied," Sarah whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Both of you." Time fractured. No one moved. No one breathed. The betrayal wasn't just a moment. It was years of deception suddenly exposed in one devastating scene. What happened next would leave them both speechless and change all three lives forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of betrayal, redemption, and sweet revenge that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Comment below what you would have done in Sarah's situation. The kitchen was filled with the rich aroma of cinnamon and maple as Sarah Williams flipped the last of the pumpkin pancakes onto the serving plate. Outside, Boston's early October air carried the first whispers of fall, painting the maple trees across their suburban neighborhood in strokes of amber and crimson. She hummed softly to herself, glancing occasionally at the clock. Robert would be down any minute, and she wanted everything to be perfect, his favorite breakfast before his Chicago business trip. "Something smells incredible." Robert's voice came from behind her, warm and appreciative as his arms encircled her waist. At 45, he still maintained the confident posture that had first attracted her to him at that faculty party 18 years ago. Sarah turned in his embrace, studying the face she knew better than her own, the laugh lines around his eyes, the distinguished touch of silver at his temples, the dimple that appeared only on the left side when he smiled. "You'll miss my cooking in Chicago," she teased, sliding the plate onto the granite countertop island they'd saved for years to install. Robert pulled her closer, his cologne, the one she'd given him last Christmas, enveloping her. "I'll miss more than that," he whispered against her ear, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that still made her heart flutter after 20 years together. "5 days will go by quickly," Sarah said, her fingers straightening his already perfect tie. "The Anderson account needs you. Your team needs you." "And you?" Robert asked, his blue eyes searching hers. "What about what you need?" Sarah smiled, appreciative of the question even after all these years. "I'll be fine. I have lunch with Jessica tomorrow, and I promised Diane I'd help her prep for her podcast interview." At the mention of Diane, something flickered across Robert's expression so brief Sarah almost missed it. A tightening around his eyes, perhaps, or a momentary stiffness in his shoulders, but before she could process it, he was smiling again, reaching for his coffee. "How is Diane still seeing that investor guy?" Robert asked, his tone casual as he cut into his pancakes. Sarah shrugged, sliding onto the stool beside him. "I don't think so. She's been evasive lately, canceled our last 2 coffee dates. Said her schedule's been crazy with the new media consultancy contracts." Robert nodded, attention fixed on his breakfast. "She's always been ambitious. Probably burning the midnight oil." "Probably," Sarah agreed, though something about Diane's recent distance had begun to gnaw at her. They'd been inseparable since being assigned as roommates their sophomore year at Boston University, through breakups, career changes, and Sarah's decision to leave teaching to support Robert's career. Diane had been her constant. Later, as Robert packed his suitcase, the expensive Toomey luggage Diane had helped Sarah select for his birthday last year, Sarah leaned against the bedroom doorframe, watching him methodically arrange his dress shirts. "Remember when we could barely afford that beaten-up duffel bag you took to interviews?" she asked, nostalgia warming her voice. Robert paused, a folded pair of slacks in his hands. "How could I forget? That was a rough time." He shook his head, the memory clearly uncomfortable. 8 months of rejection letters. I thought I'd never work in marketing again after the layoff." Sarah crossed the room, sitting on the edge of their king-size bed. "But you never gave up. All those nights practicing interviews, the research into every company." "I wouldn't have made it without you," Robert said, his hand finding hers. "I'll never forget how you believed in me when no one else did." Sarah squeezed his fingers, remembering the cramped one-bedroom apartment they'd shared back then. How she'd wake up early to iron his only good shirt before interviews. The way she'd stretch their budget to make sure he had protein with every meal. She had never complained. Not once. "We're a team," she said simply. "Always have been." Robert's expression softened. "I owe everything to you. Sarah, I hope you know that." She smiled, dismissing the heaviness of the moment. "Just bring me back one of those chocolate bars from that shop near your hotel. The ones with sea salt." "Done," he promised, zipping his suitcase closed. That afternoon, Sarah called Diane while arranging books in the home library she'd meticulously curated over the years. "Just checking in," Sarah said when Diane answered. "You've been so busy lately. I wanted to make sure you're taking care of yourself." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "I'm fine, just swamped with this new project." Diane's voice came through flat, distracted. "Back-to-back meetings all week." "Robert's gone to Chicago until Friday," Sarah mentioned, sliding a first edition Austen back onto the shelf. "We could do a girls' night tomorrow. I'll bring that Pinot Noir you love." Another pause. "I can't tomorrow. Deadline." Sarah frowned. Diane never turned down wine, especially not after a stressful day. "Thursday, then I can make those goat cheese appetizers I'll have to check my calendar." Diane cut in. "I'll text you." "Okay, I've got to run meeting in 5. Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, unease settling in her stomach. When had conversations with Diane become so stilted? So formal, Sarah scrolled back through their text history. Noticing how Diane's messages had grown increasingly brief over the past 2 months, that evening, Sarah found herself in the spare bedroom closet, pulling out a dusty box of photo albums. She settled on the carpet, opening the oldest one to pictures from their college days. There she was at 20, arms slung around Diane's shoulders, both of them beaming in front of their first off-campus apartment. Sarah's hair was longer then, chestnut waves cascading past her shoulders, while Diane's was cropped short in the pixie cut that had accentuated her sharp cheekbones. "I practically raised you," Sarah murmured, fingertips tracing Diane's face in the faded photograph. Back then, Diane had nothing. Her parents had cut her off when she'd switched from finance to communications, calling it a frivolous pursuit. Sarah, despite her own modest teaching assistant stipend, had shared everything: her food, her clothes, even her textbooks. She flipped to another page, Diane curled in a ball on their threadbare couch, eyes red from crying after another anxiety attack. Sarah had missed 3 classes that day to stay with her, to make sure she ate, to help her breathe through the panic. Their friendship had never been equal. Sarah had always given more, been more stable, more nurturing, but she never minded. Diane needed her, and there was something powerful in being needed. Sarah remembered the night Diane had wanted to drop out entirely. "I can't do this anymore," she'd sobbed, hyperventilating on their bathroom floor. Sarah had knelt beside her, hands steady on Diane's trembling shoulders. "Yes, you can," she'd insisted. "And you will. I'm not letting you give up." The next day, Sarah had gone to the financial aid office and begged for an extension on her own tuition payment so Diane could stay enrolled. No one had stood by Diane like Sarah had, even when people warned her, calling Diane manipulative or self-centered. Sarah had defended her fiercely. "They just don't understand her," she would say. "She's had it rough." Now, sitting in her comfortable home surrounded by the life she and Robert had built, Sarah didn't question that loyalty for even a second. Diane was her sister in all the ways that mattered. She had no idea she was looking back at a foundation already laced with betrayal. By the 3rd evening of Robert's trip, Sarah had developed the habit of checking her phone every few minutes. He had called briefly the first night, sounding tired but affectionate. The second night, he'd sent a voice message, "Exhausted after client meetings, missing you, get some sleep, love you." But tonight, nothing. Just a message that showed he'd read her text but hadn't responded. She tried not to overthink it. After all, the Anderson account was huge. He was probably in some dinner meeting that ran late. Still, when she called him at 10 p.m., the phone rang twice before going to voicemail. Sarah frowned, setting her phone down on the coffee table. She forced a laugh, telling herself he'd probably fallen asleep early. The meetings must be draining him. She curled up on the sofa with a bowl of pasta, scrolling through photos from their anniversary trip to Maine last year. Her finger paused over one where Robert kissed her cheek at sunrise. The lighthouse at Portland Head creating a perfect backdrop. They looked happy. They were happy, weren't they? Meanwhile, Diane's responses had grown increasingly terse. Sarah had sent her a funny meme earlier that day and received nothing but a one-word reply hours later. Lol. Diane hadn't called in 3 days. Unusual considering how often they used to chat, especially when Robert traveled. Everyone's just busy, Sarah whispered to herself, a smile that didn't reach her eyes crossing her face. She hated being the kind of woman who questioned her husband's movements or worried about her best friend's silence. She prided herself on being secure, evolved, mature. But there was something about the way her world had suddenly grown too quiet that set her on edge. She looked around the empty house, the home she'd created so carefully, and whispered, "Where is everybody?" The grandfather clock in the hallway, an heirloom from Robert's family, ticked louder than usual, its pendulum swinging like a hypnotist's watch. What Sarah didn't realize was that the silence wasn't innocent. It was loaded, and it was about to shatter everything she thought she knew. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed Thursday night, her phone glowing dimly in her palm. She had sent Diane 4 messages that day, one asking if she was okay, another sharing a joke about their old professor, and 2 voice notes filled with casual chatter. None had been answered, not even a thumbs-up emoji. For 2 women who used to speak multiple times daily, this abrupt gap in communication wasn't just odd, it was unsettling. Sarah opened her gallery and stared at a picture they had taken just 3 weeks ago. Arms locked around each other's shoulders, faces lit with laughter at a charity gala. "You better not be ghosting me because of another guy," she muttered, half laughing to herself. Diane had a pattern of pulling away when she was emotionally entangled, but she usually came around quickly, often calling Sarah at midnight to analyze every text message from her latest romance. Still, something didn't feel like the usual cycle. Something felt intentional, calculated even. The next morning, Sarah dialed Diane's number before her first cup of coffee. It rang 3 times before disconnecting. Her brows furrowed as she dialed again. This time, straight to voicemail. She stared at the screen for a moment before calling Jessica, their mutual friend from college who now ran a successful interior design business in Cambridge. "Is it weird if your best friend goes totally silent for 3 days?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Weird with Diane?" Jessica questioned, the sound of fabric swatches rustling in the background. "Extremely." Jessica hesitated before answering. "You sure nothing happened between you two?" Sarah sighed, rolling her eyes though no one could see her. "No, at least not that I'm aware of." Another pause. "Maybe she's going through something she doesn't know how to talk about." That possibility gnawed at Sarah. What if Diane needed her and didn't know how to reach out? The thought pulled her deeper into guilt than suspicion. "I'll give her space," Sarah murmured. "She'll come around. She always does." But as she tucked the phone away and walked toward her home office window, she didn't feel the light that usually came from believing the best. Instead, the clouds outside matched the unease gathering in her spirit. Robert would be home tomorrow evening. Maybe then the world would right itself again. On Saturday morning, Sarah decided to do the laundry herself instead of waiting for Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper who came on Tuesdays. As she sorted through the clothes, her fingers paused at Robert's navy blue dress shirt, the one he'd worn on the first day of his Chicago trip. She brought it close to fold it, but a faint floral scent clung to the collar. Subtle, expensive, and distinctly unfamiliar. Sarah frowned, bringing the fabric to her nose for a second inhale. The fragrance was far from her usual citrus perfumes. In fact, it bore a strange resemblance to a body spray. Diane wore the one she claimed reminded her of spring rain and new beginnings. A slow chill spread through Sarah's chest. "It's probably nothing," she said out loud, forcing a laugh. Maybe someone hugged him. Maybe it was hotel laundry detergent. But the more she tried to rationalize it, the more the scent refused to fade. It was the kind of perfume that lingered and taunted. Later that day, Sarah brought up the scent casually over a call with Jessica while they discussed plans for redecorating Sarah's guest bathroom. "Have you ever caught a smell on your husband's clothes that didn't belong to you?" she asked, her voice light but probing. Jessica didn't hesitate. "If I did, I'd ask questions immediately, especially if it smelled like another woman's skin." Sarah laughed it off, trying to stay composed. "It's probably just paranoia. You know me, overthinking everything." But as the day wore on, she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind. She even retrieved the shirt again and held it close, as though the scent might suddenly confess something. Her mind began drawing lines where none had existed before the quiet phone. The one-word text from Diane, the muted video calls with Robert, and now this perfume, barely there, but unmistakable. Her heart whispered a warning her head refused to acknowledge yet. Not without proof, not until she was sure. After all, what kind of monster would even think to suspect their best friend? It was during lunch the following Tuesday that Jessica dropped something that made Sarah's fork pause mid-air. "I saw Diane last week," Jessica said casually, taking a sip of her iced tea. Sarah looked up. "Oh, where?" Jessica hesitated, her fork hovering over her niçoise salad. "At Nordstrom in Copley Place, but not the one near her office downtown, the one all the way across the city." Sarah blinked. "That's completely out of her way." Jessica nodded, then added, "She wasn't alone. She had a basket full of stuffed men's shaving cream, cologne, even slippers. I assumed it was for a boyfriend or maybe her brother visiting, but she looked off, like she didn't want to be seen." Sarah's hand tightened slightly around her fork. "Maybe she was just rushing," she replied carefully. Jessica shrugged. "Maybe. Just thought it was odd." Back at her desk, Sarah couldn't focus. Her mind kept circling back to Jessica's story. Diane had never mentioned going to Copley Place, and she definitely never mentioned seeing anyone new. Still, Sarah couldn't justify confronting her about shopping for male toiletries. That would sound ridiculous, paranoid even. Yet the gnawing sensation in her gut returned, more insistent than before. "Why keep something like that from me?" she whispered to herself. Later that night, she sat in bed staring at her ceiling, recalling the number of times she'd shared her deepest fears with Diane, the nights they'd prayed together, cried together, even celebrated Robert's big promotion with a girls' night in. "We said no secrets," Sarah whispered into the darkness. But now, silence echoed louder than trust, and she was beginning to realize things didn't just feel off, they were. The world had often viewed Diane as difficult, abrasive even, but to Sarah, she had always been misunderstood. Not malicious. When people distanced themselves from Diane during her mood spirals or outbursts, Sarah remained her unwavering shield. There was a time 3 years ago when Diane had disappeared from work for 2 weeks, locking herself in her apartment during a depressive episode, while others gossiped. Sarah stayed by her door every evening, slipping in notes, food, and once even singing their college fight song through the keyhole to make her smile. "You're not alone, Di," she had whispered, pressing her forehead against the door. When Diane finally opened up, she had collapsed into Sarah's arms. No therapist, no sibling, no partner had stood by her like that. Sarah became her lifeline in a world that seemed to always hand Diane more darkness than light. And yet, as Sarah replayed those memories now, something inside her shifted. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was confused. Why had Diane grown so distant? Why had their once intertwined lives become a one-way street of emotional investment? Sarah had given up a department head position at her school just to keep working closer to Diane's office when she had her anxiety flare-ups. Robert himself had once warned her, "Diane depends on you too much. Sarah, one day you'll lose yourself trying to carry her pain." But Sarah had ignored him. "That's what real friends do," she had replied firmly. Now, however, sitting at her dressing table combing her hair absent-mindedly, she began to confront something she had always avoided. Had Diane ever truly reciprocated the same depth of loyalty? Or had Sarah been offering sacrificial love to someone who only knew how to take? These weren't accusations. They were quiet realizations clawing their way through the fog of her heart. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Sarah made her decision. She woke up unusually early, filled with a strange resolve that had been building like a storm behind her ribs. She had tried to convince herself that Diane was simply overwhelmed, maybe even going through something privately. But the silence had dragged on long enough, and she could no longer deny the dull ache of uncertainty gnawing at her. "I'll take her that chicken soup she loves," she said, half to herself, half to the walls. "With the rosemary biscuits," she remembered how Diane used to say. "No one cooks for me like you do. Sarah, it's like you pour love directly into the food." The thought brought a smile to her lips, albeit faint. Sarah prepared everything lovingly, the familiar routine of cooking, providing a temporary distraction from her worries. She added an extra sprig of thyme to the soup, Diane's favorite herb, and carefully packed the still-warm biscuits in a checkered cloth. She added a bottle of Pinot Noir, the expensive kind they usually save for celebrations. There was no warning, no call ahead. Sarah still had a spare key Diane had given her years ago during one of her depressive episodes. "My door is your door, always," Diane had said, pressing the key into Sarah's palm. As Sarah drove through the Saturday morning traffic, her heart was a mixture of anticipation and quiet dread. Maybe they'd laugh over her dramatic entrance, and everything would return to normal. Maybe Diane would cry and confess something deeper was going on, a health scare, financial troubles, another broken heart. Anything, really. Anything but what she would actually find. When she parked outside Diane's upscale apartment complex in Back Bay, the place looked quiet, unassuming. The red brick building with its wrought iron details had always seemed to Sarah like the perfect reflection of Diane herself, classic, but with unexpected edges. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, the food basket swinging gently from her elbow, her low heels clicking lightly on the polished wood floors. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid the key into the lock. Inside, the apartment was strangely warm and smelled faintly of bacon and coffee, as if someone had just finished breakfast. "Di," she called out gently. No answer. Then, faintly, the sound of running water. Sarah smiled nervously. Maybe Diane was in the shower. Perfect timing, the soup would still be warm when she got out. She moved toward the kitchen to set down the food, but then paused. A man's watch, an expensive Rolex, sat on the dining table. Her stomach twisted. Next to it, a leather laptop bag she recognized with sickening clarity. The shower stopped, and footsteps padded toward the living room. The bathroom door creaked open, and there he stood, Robert, her husband, bare chest, hair wet, towel wrapped low around his waist, water droplets still clinging to his shoulders. Sarah stood frozen, her hands still gripping the handle of the food basket, though she could no longer feel her fingers. Robert looked equally stunned, his mouth opening but no words emerging. For a split second, the world held its breath. What are you doing here?" he finally stammered, stepping back slightly, eyes darting behind her as if checking whether she'd come alone. She couldn't breathe. "What am I doing here?" Her voice cracked. "What are you doing here?" "Robert." The food basket slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a soft thud, the soup container cracking open, spreading across the cream-colored tiles like a slow-moving stain. "Robert, who is it?" Diane's voice came next, soft and breathless from the hallway. Then she appeared, wrapped in a silk robe, her damp curls framing her face. When she saw Sarah, her expression collapsed in horror. "Sarah," time fractured. No one moved. No one breathed. Sarah looked from one face to the other, her heart thudding so hard she thought it might explode right there in her chest. A violent end to 20 years of love and trust. "You lied," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Both of you. You lied to me." Robert stepped forward, towel still clinging precariously to his hips, as though that made his presence less obscene. "I can explain." "Sarah," her lips trembled. Explain how your Chicago business trip led to my best friend's shower." Diane tried to speak, but her voice failed her. The silence stretched unbearably, pressing down on all of them. Sarah turned around slowly, as if walking in a dream. Her legs felt heavy, each step a betrayal echoing through her body. She didn't run, she didn't scream, but as she pulled the door open, she left behind more than spilled food. She left behind the version of herself who had once believed in unconditional loyalty. And outside that door, under the suddenly too bright Boston sky, a new version of Sarah started to breathe, one that would never be blind again. The hallway outside Diane's apartment was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and Sarah's heartbeat, which thundered in her ears. She stood just outside the door, trembling, the sound of her own breath ragged as if her lungs were learning how to function in a world that had just betrayed her. Behind her, the door was still ajar, as if daring her to turn back. But she didn't. She couldn't. Robert hadn't moved. Diane hadn't stepped forward. The weight of their silence screamed louder than any apology. When the door creaked softly behind her, Sarah turned her head just enough to see Diane's silhouette framed in the warm light of the apartment, the home that, Sarah now realized with crushing clarity, had been furnished with her husband's money and her husband's presence all along. "Sarah, I didn't mean for you to find out like this," Diane said quietly, her arms folded over her chest, not from shame. Sarah noted with distant surprise, but as if bracing for impact. Sarah didn't respond. Her voice had lodged itself deep in her throat, suffocating beneath layers of betrayal. Diane took a step forward. "We were going to tell you. Eventually." The absurdity of the words slapped Sarah back into her body. She turned fully now, her eyes wet but blazing with a newfound fury. "Tell me you were going to tell me that you've been sleeping with my husband, living with him while sending me 'I love you' texts and calling me sister, like you weren't hiding knives in your robe." Diane flinched, her mouth opening to speak but no words forming. Robert appeared behind her, towel exchanged for hastily pulled-on pants, his chest still bare, as if he couldn't be bothered to fully dress for the collapse of his marriage. "I didn't plan for it to go this far," he said, his voice strangely flat. "It just happened." Sarah let out a broken laugh. "Things don't just happen. Robert, you chose this, and so did she." She turned again, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I came here to bring her soup, to check on her." The heartbreak cracked through her chest like thunder. "I thought something was wrong with her, but I didn't know it was me." And with that, she walked away. No yelling, no pleading, just footsteps, heavy with the sound of love dying. Sarah stumbled into her car and slammed the door, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding her to earth. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her mind replayed what she had just witnessed: the shower, the robe, the watch on the table, the casual domesticity of it all, the audacity. She leaned her forehead against the wheel and let out a guttural cry, one that came from a part of her soul she hadn't touched before. She had been disrespected in the most intimate way possible, and what hurt more was how calmly they had stood there, as if her pain was a small inconvenience in their Saturday morning routine. Her phone vibrated. Robert, then Diane, then Robert again. She stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. Then a message appeared. "Please, let's talk. You misunderstood everything." That was the final insult. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat like it was coated in filth. Back at home, the home she had built with Robert, the home where she had hosted countless dinners with Diane as an honored guest, Sarah stormed into the bedroom and began pulling clothes from the wardrobe. His suits, his ties, everything. She flung them onto the floor and stood staring at the mess, like she wasn't sure if she should scream or burn them all. "You don't get to cheat and still own space in my home," she muttered, dragging a suitcase out from under the bed. Her chest heaved as she packed without focus, just needing to remove every trace of him from her sight. Her phone rang again, Diane's name flashing across the screen, against her better judgment. She answered, her voice cold. "What do you want?" Diane's voice trembled on the other end. "Please, Sarah. I know you're angry, but you don't understand." "Don't tell me what I understand," Sarah snapped, her composure finally cracking. "You were my friend. I trusted you with everything. You told me you loved me like a sister. You helped me plan our anniversary dinner while poisoning my marriage." There was silence. Then Diane whispered, "I didn't want to hurt you." Sarah laughed bitterly. "But you did. Every time you kissed him, you carved pieces out of me." She ended the call and blocked them both. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window in darkness, her heart fractured, her eyes swollen, and her soul preparing for a war she never thought she'd fight. The next morning, Sarah met Jessica at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Away from their usual haunts, her eyes were sunken, and her voice had lost its usual warmth. She hadn't cried in front of anyone yet, but the grief sat just beneath her skin, waiting for any crack to spill out. Jessica reached across the table and held her hand. "Tell me everything," she said gently. Sarah inhaled deeply and told her from beginning to end, from the towel to the perfume, to the silence. Jessica listened without interrupting, her brows furrowing deeper as the story unfolded. When Sarah mentioned the apartment, Jessica's expression changed. "Wait, you said he came out of her shower and the place it didn't look like a visitor's space." Sarah nodded slowly. "His watch was on the table. His laptop bag was there. It looked established." Jessica leaned in. "Let's find out exactly how established. My cousin works in property management. She can check the lease information." Sarah blinked. "How? Just trust me." "Within hours." Jessica handed Sarah a printed tenant information sheet. Sarah stared at it in disbelief. Robert Williams. Her hands trembled as she read it again. Not only had he lied, but he had signed the lease on Diane's apartment nearly 14 months ago, long before the business trips became frequent. Long before the late nights at the office started stretching into mornings. 14 months, Sarah whispered, the timeline unfolding with sickening clarity. He was building a life with her while sleeping in my bed. Jessica reached out, but Sarah jerked back, her entire body quivering. "I feel like a clown," she said, voice breaking. "Like everyone knew but me." Jessica's eyes filled with sorrow. "You didn't deserve this, Sarah, not one bit." Sarah nodded slowly, her voice hardening as she folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her purse. "No, but they're both going to feel every ounce of this pain. I swear it." For the first time since the betrayal, something else flickered in her eyes beneath the hurt of cold. Calculated fire. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor of her home office, surrounded by every receipt, card, and bank statement she had ever bothered to file away. She had never paid much attention to them before. Why would she? She trusted Robert, but now, every slip of paper was a potential confession. She opened his desk drawer and found a leather portfolio she had always ignored, assuming it contained work documents. Her hands trembled as she pulled out what looked like travel itineraries, but the names of the destinations weren't business centers. They were romantic getaways. The Berkshires, Martha's Vineyard, even a weekend spa retreat in Vermont. The dates matched the times he claimed to be working late or traveling for deals. She clutched the receipts and whispered, "You planned holidays with her while telling me we needed to budget." Her eyes locked onto a photo printout tucked between two invoices, a candid picture of Robert and Diane on a beach. He was kissing her shoulder. Diane was wearing the same sunglasses Sarah had gifted her 2 Christmases ago. A heavy sob choked in her throat, and she grabbed her phone, scrolling back through her own calendar. One particular trip hit her like a storm. The Vermont weekend had taken place during the same period Sarah was in the hospital for exhaustion after working double shifts to organize a charity fundraiser. Robert had visited once, stayed 15 minutes, and said work was crazy. Now she knew where he had really been drinking champagne by a fireplace with her best friend. She stood up and staggered back, her knees wobbling under the weight of reality. "How long was I sleeping beside a stranger?" she cried aloud, the room spinning around her. She had been blind, completely blind, loving a man who was rehearsing lies while tying his shoelaces every morning. The betrayal was no longer just a moment, it was a history, a timeline of deceit woven seamlessly into her everyday life. And suddenly, the marriage didn't just feel broken, it felt imaginary. Sarah's phone buzzed while she was wiping down her kitchen counter, an attempt to distract herself from the emotional avalanche threatening to consume her. She picked it up and froze at the name on the screen, Diane Cooper, voice note, against her better judgment. She pressed play. Diane's voice came through, shaky but intentional. Sarah, I don't even know where to begin. I know I've hurt you, maybe in the worst way possible, but you need to hear this. It didn't start the way you think. He came to me one night after you had a fight. He was angry, saying you didn't understand him. I should have sent him away. I should have walked out, but I didn't. I was lonely too. You were busy with your charity work and your sister's kids, and it just happened. There it was again, that phrase. A coward's anthem, it just happened. The voice note ended without a single, I'm sorry. Not once did Diane acknowledge the depth of her betrayal. Instead, she made excuses wrapped in soft tones and crocodile tears. Sarah replayed the message, her fury growing with each word. She sent a reply, her voice eerily calm. Don't ever contact me again. If I see you, I will not be responsible for what I do. She hit send, then stared out the kitchen window, eyes stinging. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the rewriting of history. Diane wanted to make herself a victim, paint herself as the woman who fell into love, rather than the one who tore apart a home. Sarah clenched her jaw and whispered, You weren't lonely, Diane. You were waiting. And now, no matter how she tried to spin it, no justification could erase the choice she had made over and over again, a choice that tore through Sarah's soul like glass. As Sarah lay in bed that night, sleep mocked her. The ceiling became a screen where memories of her wedding day played on repeat, each frame now twisted and cruel. She remembered Diane adjusting her veil, whispering, You're going to be the happiest wife alive. Robert had looked handsome in his charcoal suit, eyes filled with warmth as he vowed to love her forever. Diane had stood right beside Sarah, holding her bouquet during the vows, dabbing tears with a handkerchief, pretending to be moved. But now, in the quiet of betrayal, Sarah saw it all differently. Diane wasn't crying from joy. She was mourning her own decision to stand in the shadows, or maybe mocking Sarah with tears that no one else could decode. How dare you stand next to me knowing what you were planning with him? Sarah murmured bitterly. She sat up and reached for the wedding album in her nightstand drawer, flipping through the pages until her fingers found the group photos. There it was, Diane's hand gently resting on Robert's back in one shot, her smile just a bit too wide. Robert's gaze, now that she looked closely, didn't always stay on Sarah, in two separate frames. He was caught glancing sideways at Diane. The clues were all there, but love had blinded her. Trust had silenced her instincts. She shut the album with a sharp snap and tossed it onto the floor. I married a performance, she said to the empty room. A show. And you. Diane, you helped direct it. The realization burned, but it also cleared the fog in her mind. This wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated betrayal. Every toast, every speech, every laugh shared on that altar, they were all hollow. But if her marriage had been built on lies, then so would her revenge. Only hers would come with no warning. Robert stood at her gate like a drenched dog 3 days later, his shirt unbuttoned halfway, eyes sunken with sleeplessness. Sarah hadn't expected to see him so soon, definitely not on a Sunday morning. She folded her arms as she stepped out onto the porch, her expression unreadable. You've got 10 seconds, she said sharply. Robert ran a hand over his face. Sarah, I know you're hurt, but can we just talk? You weren't supposed to find out this way. She narrowed her eyes. So I was supposed to keep feeding you, loving you, while you juggled hotel reservations and toothbrushes between us? His shoulders sagged. Diane was a mistake. I swear I didn't mean for it to continue. I thought I could stop. Sarah let out a cold, bitter laugh. You rented her an apartment. Robert, that's not a fling. That's a second life. He took a step closer, but she didn't flinch. You weren't there. Sarah, you were always busy, your charity work, your sister's family, your book club. I needed comfort. She was there. Her mouth twitched as she shook her head. So I'm to blame for your infidelity because I was building a life for us. I was helping my sister through a divorce. I wasn't unavailable. Robert, I was married to a man who only wanted convenience, not commitment. His voice broke. I know I failed you, but I still love you. She raised her hand. Don't you dare say that word to me. You don't love people you betray. You don't love people you lie to while they lie next to you in bed. Robert lowered his gaze, shame flooding his face. What do you want me to do? He whispered. She stared at him for a long, heavy moment before replying. I want you to feel what it's like to lose everything. Then she turned, walked back inside, and locked the door. 3 days after Robert's visit, Sarah opened her front door to find David Taylor Roberts' former boss standing on the porch, holding a brown envelope. His face was tired, not from age but from witnessing too much disappointment in people. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me, he said gently. Sarah blinked in surprise, nodding slowly before stepping aside to let him in. I won't take much of your time, David began as he sat down on the edge of the sofa. But I think you deserve to hear something from someone who saw part of the storm coming. Sarah folded her arms protectively across her chest. Go on, he sighed. Robert came to me last year asking for a considerable raise. I asked why he needed it so urgently, and he told me he was supporting his cousin who had mental health struggles and needed a place to stay. I believed him until I accidentally ran into him at the Four Seasons one evening. He was checking in with a woman I recognized. Diane. Sarah's stomach turned, but she remained composed. You knew. David looked remorseful. I suspected, but I had no proof. I confronted him. He swore it was just a business client. Insisted I misunderstood. I wanted to believe him he was one of our best negotiators, and I thought maybe I was being too cynical. Sarah bit the inside of her cheek to keep her tears from falling. So you saw the cracks too? David leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I resigned recently, not just because of company changes, but because I couldn't keep pretending to respect someone who wore masks so well. I'm sorry, Sarah. You deserved honesty. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time, seeing not just her husband's ex-boss, but a man carrying his own quiet regrets. Thank you, she said sincerely, for not sugarcoating it. I think I needed to hear it from someone who wasn't lying to my face for months. As David stood to leave, he gently placed the envelope on her coffee table. There are some things in there you might find useful. He paused at the door. Whatever you decide next, I hope it includes healing. The house was still, save for the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the ticking wall clock that suddenly felt too loud. Sarah sat cross-legged on her living room rug, papers scattered before her memories and chaos around her. She stared at her reflection in the glass coffee table, hollow eyes, dry lips, tired skin, somewhere along the way. She had given everything her loyalty, her time, her youth, and now she sat emptied by the very people she had filled. What was I even doing all this for? She muttered. She remembered the nights she stayed up altering Robert's suits when he gained weight during his unemployment, the weekends she canceled just to help Diane prepare her content for a media pitch. And now they were both sitting in the ruins of what used to be her life, trying to make sense of their shame with excuses. She reached for a photo of herself and Robert at a company dinner. She stared at her own smile. Who is this woman? She whispered. Because I don't recognize her anymore. Jessica came over that evening with takeout and no questions. She just sat, handed Sarah a plate, and waited, after a few bites. Sarah set her fork down and finally spoke. You know what hurts the most? Sarah asked quietly. Jessica shook her head softly. It's not the cheating, not even the lies. It's realizing that I poured into people who were only ever thirsty for more, never full, never grateful. Jessica's eyes welled up, but she remained silent, letting Sarah continue. I forgot myself in them. I lost my voice, my joy. I don't even remember what I like anymore. Jessica finally spoke. Then it's time you start finding those pieces again. And this time, no one gets to chip away at you while you're doing it. Sarah nodded slowly. For the first time in weeks, her tears didn't feel helpless. They felt cleansing. She didn't want pity. She didn't even want revenge yet. What she wanted first was to remember who she was before she became a footnote in someone else's story. The backyard was quiet, still damp from last night's rain. Sarah stood beneath the maple tree, wearing a black dress not because someone had died, but because something had before her. A small metal fire pit stood open, flames dancing gently inside it. In her hands, she held the remnants of a love she had once fought so hard to protect: wedding photos, anniversary cards, love notes scribbled on sticky notes. She dropped them in one by one, watching them curl and darken under the fire's kiss. "This isn't about revenge," she murmured. "It's about closure." The smoke lifted like a final prayer as she pulled out the last item, her wedding dress. She'd kept it wrapped for years, preserving it like a sacred artifact. Now she held it to her chest, took one long breath, and whispered, "I gave you the best parts of me." Then she fed it to the flames. Jessica stood a few feet away, watching in respectful silence, when Sarah turned to her, tears streaking her face but her posture upright. Jessica opened her arms. They hugged not like friends, but like women who had walked through fire and stood back up. "You sure you don't want to keep anything?" Jessica asked gently. Sarah shook her head. "No. The only thing I need to hold on to is myself, and I'm finally starting to find her again." As the last threads of satin and lace burned into ash, the heaviness in her chest loosened just a little. This wasn't just an act of grief, it was a rite of passage. The goodbye not just to Robert or Diane, but to the woman who thought love meant tolerating everything. Sarah watched the smoke rise higher and let it carry her pain into the sky. This was the end of what was, and the quiet beginning of what would be. Sarah didn't post a single word on social media, no cryptic quotes, no passive-aggressive messages, just silence. It was calculated, intentional. Robert and Diane might have expected a storm, but Sarah wasn't interested in theatrics. She wanted impact, and impact needed precision. She started gathering evidence, not just receipts and lease documents, but screenshots, timestamps, and copies of emails Robert had forwarded to her over the years without thinking twice. In them, she found names of companies he had misrepresented in deals and how he had quietly redirected percentages meant for junior staff into his own accounts. Her hands shook as she printed everything, but her face remained calm. "They burned me in silence," she told Jessica over coffee one morning. "Let me return the favor with structure." That week, she scheduled an anonymous meeting with one of David's former board contacts, using a different email address and meeting at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Boston. "Don't say my name," she typed in the email before clicking send. "Just follow the trail." Meanwhile, she requested a quiet sit-down with a family lawyer, just in case. Sarah wasn't just reacting anymore. She was repositioning herself. Every time Robert tried to call or message, she ignored it, not because she had nothing to say, but because her silence was louder than anything she could scream. Diane, too, tried reaching out via fake numbers and email accounts. Sarah blocked each one with clinical precision. She wasn't interested in their guilt-laced pleas. She had finally found her voice, and it spoke in strategic moves, not emotional outbursts. In this game, they were still playing checkers. She had started playing chess on a cloudy Thursday afternoon. Robert walked into his office only to be greeted by two men in dark suits, internal auditors. The HR manager stood stiffly beside them, her face unreadable. "Mr. Williams, please come with us," she said simply. He was too stunned to ask why. Within 20 minutes, he was sitting in a small conference room, being shown documents he had signed, diverted funds he thought no one had noticed, expense accounts flagged as client development, but traced back to Diane's apartment, rent, and travel. "We've been monitoring the irregularities," one auditor said calmly, "but recent evidence confirmed what we feared. You've breached multiple company codes." Robert swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Wait, where did this come from? Who?" He stopped himself, his mouth suddenly tasting like metal. The timing, the accuracy. It all pointed to one person, Sarah. Later that evening, he received the termination letter and was escorted out of the building. No ceremony, no exit interview, just cold dismissal. As he stood by the sidewalk holding a cardboard box filled with his belongings, he pulled out his phone and tried calling her again. No answer. He texted, "Please, Sarah, can we talk? Everything is falling apart." Either. But the message remained unread. He lowered himself onto a nearby bench, head in hands, his pride unraveling thread by thread. For years, he had believed Sarah was weak, quiet, naive. Now he was beginning to understand that she hadn't been weak, she had simply loved him. And now that love had turned to silence. And that silence was the loudest consequence he had ever heard. Diane's world began unraveling with a single blog post. A whistleblower account posted screenshots of emails between her and Robert, revealing personal and financial entanglements that contradicted the brand she had built, Empowered Women Media, overnight. Her comment section turned hostile. Sponsors pulled out. Speaking engagements were postponed indefinitely. Her manager dropped her with a one-line message. "We can't align with your current narrative." She sat in her apartment, surrounded by untouched food, rereading the comments online. This is the woman who preaches female loyalty while sleeping with her friend's husband and still recording podcasts on integrity. Diane tried posting a vague apology, something about human error and growth, but it backfired. She deleted it within the hour. 2 nights later, her doorbell rang. She opened it to find her younger sister, Melissa, standing there with a suitcase. "Mom sent me," Melissa said flatly. "She said you need company, and probably prayers." Diane rolled her eyes but stepped aside. "It's not that bad," she muttered. Melissa gave her a long stare. "Di, you're trending for all the wrong reasons. I'm here to make sure you don't lose your mind before you lose what's left of your platform." Diane collapsed onto the couch, rubbing her temples. "Why is she doing this to me? I already lost Robert. Why destroy everything else?" Melissa scoffed. "You didn't lose him, Diane. He wasn't yours to begin with. You stole him, and now the real owner is making sure you never forget it." Diane buried her face in her hands, her carefully curated empire crumbling around her. She had underestimated Sarah, and now she was paying for it with silence from followers. Slashed contracts, and a growing emptiness that money couldn't fix. It wasn't planned. Robert appeared outside Sarah's new apartment on a rainy evening, holding an umbrella and a crumpled manila envelope. She had moved weeks ago without telling anyone, but somehow he found her. She opened the door halfway, her expression blank. "You're not supposed to be here," she said coolly. He nodded, drenched despite the umbrella. I needed to see you, to say something face to face." Sarah crossed her arms. "You said enough with your actions." He stepped forward slightly. "I lost everything. Sarah, my job, my reputation, even Diane's turned on me. But you still haunt me." She let out a quiet sigh. "Haunt, no. I simply exist. And for the first time, you're seeing me clearly." He handed her the envelope with trembling hands. "My resignation letter. My apology in writing, if it means anything." She took it without opening it. "Do you really think that erases what you did?" He shook his head. "No. I wanted you to know that I see the damage, that I'm not hiding anymore." She looked at him tired, unshaven, broken, but her heart didn't stir. Not with love, only with closure. "You thought I'd fall apart, didn't you? That I'd beg or spiral, but I rebuilt myself from the ruin you left." Robert looked down, voice cracking. "I don't know how to move on, Sarah." She stepped back and replied calmly. "Then start by sitting with your guilt, like I sat with your lies every night." She closed the door slowly, leaving him on the doorstep with nothing but his regrets. That night, she slept peacefully for the first time in a long while. The email arrived at dawn, titled simply, "From me to you." Sarah almost deleted it on sight, but curiosity overpowered restraint. It was from Diane. The body of the message contained one long paragraph. You don't owe me forgiveness. I can't undo what I've done. But I need you to know that I am no longer the woman who laughed behind your back while calling you sister. I lost my way. I ruined the only person who ever loved me without conditions. And I hope someday you'll find room to heal where my betrayal once lived. Sarah stared at the screen for several minutes, then closed her laptop. No reply, no reaction, just silence. Later that afternoon, she sat with Jessica in a quiet garden cafe, sipping chilled lemonade. She reached out again, Sarah said flatly. Jessica raised a brow, and Sarah shrugged. She wants peace or redemption. I'm not sure which. Jessica stirred her drink. You giving it to her? Sarah's lips curled slightly. I gave her more than she deserved when I trusted her. I won't spend my new peace trying to hand her pieces of it. They clinked their glasses in quiet solidarity. Diane's words held no weight anymore, not because they were insincere, but because Sarah no longer sought validation from the same voice that had once betrayed her. And in that choice to remain silent, she reclaimed power. Sometimes the greatest closure isn't what you say, it's what you walk away from and never return to. The legal office smelled of freshly printed documents and furniture polish. Sarah sat across from her lawyer, a dignified woman in her early 60s named Mrs. Finch, who wore her compassion like a second skin. A single sheet of paper sat between them, the divorce decree, stamped and ready. Sarah held the pen but hesitated for a moment. Are you sure you're ready? Mrs. Finch asked softly. Sarah nodded, more to herself than to the lawyer. I stayed longer than I should have. This signature isn't about anger. It's about breathing again. With one clean motion, she signed her name at the bottom. Just like that. The legal bond to Robert was severed. No noise, no announcement. Just ink on paper and the quiet strength of a woman choosing herself. As she walked out of the building, the autumn sun hit her face with an almost theatrical warmth. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she inhaled deeply and whispered to herself, "You're free." Her phone buzzed with a message from her sister, who had heard whispers about the divorce. Come stay with us for a while. You've fought enough. Sarah typed back, I'm not running. I'm rising. She had chosen to keep everything off social media, no status updates. No dramatic exits. The people who needed to know knew. Those who didn't never mattered anyway. She spent the rest of the day reorganizing her apartment, moving things around, not because she needed to, but because she could. The sound of her laughter echoed softly in her new space. That evening, as she stood barefoot in her kitchen, dancing while cooking her favorite pasta, it wasn't for anyone this time, not a man, not a friend, just her, and it felt revolutionary. It was at a professional networking brunch, something Jessica had practically dragged her to, that Sarah saw David Taylor again. He stood near the coffee bar, sharply dressed but noticeably less stiff than she remembered. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it felt as though time had slowed just enough to allow something gentle to pass between them. I didn't expect to see you here, he said, smiling. I nearly didn't come, Sarah replied, but something told me to say yes today. They chatted casually at first about work, new ventures, shared acquaintances, but beneath the polite banter was a current of something warmer. David didn't pry into her past or tread around her pain. He simply talked to her. Not about her. That alone made her breathe easier. 2 weeks later, he invited her for dinner, nothing flashy, just grilled salmon at a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking the harbor. Sarah wore a soft burgundy dress and minimal makeup. When she walked in, David stood up, eyes soft with admiration but no pressure. You look like peace, he said, pulling out her chair. Over dinner, their conversation meandered through books, childhood quirks, and their mutual love for jazz. At one point, he reached across the table not for her hand, but just to rest his fingers near hers, a gesture of presence, not possession. I don't want to fill any empty space, he said gently, but if you ever want company in your new beginning, I'm here. Sarah smiled not because she was in love, but because, for once, she wasn't afraid to begin again. The chapter that followed wouldn't be rushed this time. She would write it, not survive it. The market street was unusually crowded that afternoon, a mixture of car horns and street vendor calls hanging thick in the air. Sarah walked with Jessica, holding shopping bags and chatting about a potential business expansion. Then she saw him. At first, she wasn't sure the ragged jeans, the cracked lips, the beard that hadn't seen a razor in weeks. But when his eyes met hers, the familiarity cut through the grime. Robert. He was seated on a bench beside a newspaper stand, clutching a threadbare backpack and drinking coffee from a paper cup. Their eyes locked for a long second. Then he looked down, as if ashamed to exist in her line of sight. Jessica noticed too. "Do you want to leave?" she asked gently. Sarah shook her head. "No. Let him see what dignity looks like when it survives betrayal." She walked past him slowly, her head held high. Robert didn't say a word. He didn't beg. He didn't apologize. He just sat there, fading. But Sarah didn't feel victorious. She felt whole. She turned once, briefly, and their eyes met again. This time, she offered no glare, no smirk, just a calm nod. A silent acknowledgement that this was the last time he would occupy space in her story. He had gambled her love away and lost it all. She had walked away and gained everything. And as she and Jessica turned the corner, disappearing into the life she had rebuilt, she whispered to herself, "This is justice. Quiet, clean, unapologetic." Diane's voice, once booming across podcasts and radio interviews, had vanished entirely from public platforms. Her last attempt at a comeback, an online video titled "Owning My Journey," was met with such public outrage that she took it down within hours. Her email subscribers dwindled. Partnerships crumbled. She slowly faded from relevance. Sarah only knew because people occasionally sent her updates. "Have you seen what's happened to Diane?" Someone texted. Sarah didn't respond. She no longer gave oxygen to names that once suffocated her. The media had moved on. So had the audience. But Diane was left behind in the silence she once believed would never find her. Word eventually reached Sarah that Diane had left Boston altogether. Some said she went back to Connecticut to stay with an older aunt. Others claimed she was trying to rebuild under a different name. But for Sarah, the destination didn't matter. "I don't need her to fall," she told Jessica one morning while watering her balcony plants. "I just needed her gone." Jessica smiled, understanding the weight behind those words. Not all victories required a front row seat. Some were meant to be felt in the peace that followed. And peace, finally, was steady. The memory of Diane no longer triggered pain, but served as a quiet reminder love should never require blindness. It was not about vengeance anymore. It was about preservation. Diane had disappeared not because she was exiled, but because her own conscience became too loud to live beside. The new studio sat on the top floor of a modest complex overlooking the harbor. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped into the space that would soon become the headquarters of her wellness brand. Shelves stood empty. Walls were freshly painted. The scent of new beginnings clung to every corner. She walked across the room in slow strides, hand grazing the smooth edge of her soon-to-arrive desk. "You built this," she whispered to herself, not from compensation or charity, but from survival, strategy, and soul. Her first launch was only weeks away, a self-care subscription box curated by women for women recovering from betrayal, burnout, or both. It wasn't just business, it was healing in a box. A love letter to the version of herself who once wept into her pillow without answers. That evening, David arrived with takeout and wine. They sat on the balcony, legs stretched out, the air sweet with promise. "I'm proud of you," he said, watching the sky deepen into twilight. Sarah turned to him, her eyes steady. "I'm proud of me too." They clinked glasses, the sound quiet but complete. "Do you ever miss the old life?" he asked. She thought for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't miss the person who tolerated less than she deserved." David smiled. "So what's next?" Sarah exhaled deeply, looking out over the city that had once witnessed her heartbreak. Everything is next." She didn't need a grand finish or fairy tale revenge. She had already won not because Robert had fallen, not because Diane had vanished, but because she had risen, whole, unapologetic, and finally home to herself. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Sarah received an unexpected package at her office. It contained a single envelope and a small, weathered book. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from Robert's mother. Eleanor. Dear Sarah, I found this while cleaning out Robert's childhood room. It belongs with someone who understands its value. I'm sorry for what my son took from you. Some of us still believe in honor. With respect. Eleanor. The book was a first edition poetry collection, the one Sarah had mentioned wanting to find years ago. Robert had apparently purchased it for their anniversary, but never given it to her, probably too distracted by his double life. Sarah ran her fingers over the embossed cover, feeling not pain but a strange sense of completion. She placed it on her office shelf, not as a memento of her marriage, but as a reminder that even in the midst of betrayal, there are small redemptions to be found. That night, she called Eleanor the first time they'd spoken since the divorce. The conversation was brief but healing. There were no accusations, no defense of Robert. Just two women acknowledging that some bonds survive even when others break. You were always too good for him, Eleanor said quietly before hanging up. I'm glad you found your way. Sarah added Eleanor to her Christmas card list, another unexpected turn in a journey full of them. A week later, as Sarah was reviewing the final designs for her subscription boxes, she received a text from Jessica with a link to a news article. The headline read, "Former marketing executive faces securities fraud charges." Robert's downfall had continued without her intervention. His misdeeds had caught up with him through channels she hadn't even activated. Sarah closed the article without finishing it. There was a time when such news would have brought satisfaction, maybe even joy. Now it barely registered. She had moved beyond the need for his suffering to validate her healing. The subscription box launch exceeded all expectations. Orders flooded in from across the country, women seeking what Sarah had fought so hard to find: dignity after devastation. Each box contained carefully selected items, journals with prompts for processing grief, artisanal teas, scented candles, books on rebuilding self-worth, and a personal note from Sarah. Your story isn't over. Each note began. It's just changing direction. The media picked up on her success. A local magazine wanted to feature her journey from betrayed wife to thriving entrepreneur. The reporter, a woman in her 50s who had survived her own painful divorce, asked the question Sarah had been anticipating. Do you forgive them? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Forgiveness implies they still matter enough to occupy my thoughts. What I've found is something deeper: freedom. They no longer have the power to define who I am or what I feel. The reporter nodded, understanding the distinction. And what would you tell other women facing similar betrayals? Sarah smiled. Don't waste time becoming what hurt you. Become more authentically yourself instead. That's the real victory. The article ran the following Sunday, accompanied by a photo of Sarah standing in her new office, sunlight streaming through the windows behind her. She looked serene, confident, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not just intact, but illuminated. Orders doubled the week after publication. David framed the article and hung it in her office while she was out at a meeting, a surprise that brought tears to her eyes when she returned. Not because she needed the validation, but because for the first time in her adult life, someone was celebrating her rise rather than using her strength for their own benefit. Their relationship progressed at its own gentle pace: movie nights that ended with conversations stretching until dawn, weekend drives to coastal towns with no particular destination, dinners where they talked about everything and nothing. David never pushed, never assumed, never took her presence for granted. You know what I appreciate most about you? Sarah asked him one evening as they walked along the harbor. Fall leaves crunching beneath their feet. My impeccable taste in restaurants. He teased. She laughed. Your patience. You don't try to rush the broken parts of me into healing. He took her hand, his touch light but steady. Broken things mend in their own time, and some breaks make us more interesting, don't they? On Christmas Eve, nearly a year after she discovered Robert and Diane's betrayal, Sarah hosted a small gathering at her apartment. Her sister and brother-in-law came with their children. Jessica brought her new boyfriend. David arrived early to help cook. As they sat around the table, sharing stories and laughter, Sarah felt a fullness she hadn't experienced in years. Not the desperate fullness of trying to be everything for everyone, but the genuine abundance of a life rebuilt on her own terms. When the doorbell rang unexpectedly, Sarah frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone else. She opened the door to find a young woman holding a package, late 20s. Anxious eyes, familiar somehow. "Are you Sarah Williams?" the woman asked. Sarah nodded cautiously. "I'm Amber, Diane's assistant." She held out the package. "She asked me to deliver this personally. Please don't shoot the messenger." Sarah almost refused it, but changed her mind. "Thank you, Amber. Merry Christmas." After the party, when everyone had gone and David had fallen asleep on her couch, Sarah finally opened Diane's package. Inside was a small wooden box and a letter. The box contained the friendship bracelet Sarah had given Diane on her 21st birthday, silver, with their initials engraved on the inside. The letter was brief. "I heard about your success. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what you tried to teach me all those years, that loyalty isn't a burden. It's a choice. I'm trying to make better choices now. The bracelet belongs with you, as it always did. I'm leaving Boston for good. Be happy. Sarah, you deserve it more than anyone I've ever known." Sarah didn't cry. She didn't feel anger or vindication. She simply placed the bracelet in her keepsake drawer, not to wear again, but as an artifact from a different life. Then she gently covered David with a blanket and went to bed, leaving Diane's letter on the kitchen counter. In the morning, when David asked about it, Sarah simply said, "It's the last page of an old book I'm not reading anymore." He understood, as he always did, and didn't mention it again. Spring arrived with a burst of new opportunities. Sarah's business expanded, necessitating a larger office and 3 employees. David received an offer to teach business ethics at a prestigious university, something he'd always wanted to do. They celebrated both milestones with a weekend trip to a seaside cottage in Maine. On their last evening there, walking barefoot along the shore as the sun dipped below the horizon, David stopped and turned to her. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice carrying over the gentle crash of waves. "Life is unpredictable and precious for that very reason." Sarah smiled, waiting for him to continue. "I'm not asking for forever right now," he said, taking her hands in his. "I'm just asking if I can stand beside you for whatever comes next, the good days, the hard ones, all of it." It wasn't a traditional proposal. There was no ring, no bended knee, just an honest question from a man who understood that what Sarah needed wasn't grand promises, but genuine presence. "I'd like that," she said simply, squeezing his hands. "Very much." As they walked back toward the cottage, arms linked against the evening chill, Sarah realized something profound. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her. The betrayal that had once threatened to consume her had become merely a chapter in a much longer, richer story. The following week, Sarah received a call from a women's shelter in downtown Boston. They had heard about her subscription boxes and wondered if she might donate some for their residents, many of whom were rebuilding lives after leaving abusive relationships. "Of course," Sarah said without hesitation, "and I'd like to do more, perhaps a workshop on reclaiming self-worth." The director was overjoyed. "That would be incredible. These women need to see someone who's come through darkness and found light again." The workshop was scheduled for the following month. As Sarah prepared her presentation, she realized she was no longer speaking from an open wound, but from a place of genuine healing. The pain had transformed into purpose on the day of the workshop. As she stood before a room of women whose eyes reflected back the same determination she had discovered in herself, Sarah began with a simple truth. What was meant to destroy you can become the foundation on which you build something stronger than before. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually, with persistence and grace. She saw heads nodding, eyes glistening with recognition. These women understood. as she did. That survival itself was an act of defiance. Afterward, as she was gathering her materials, a woman approached her mid-50s, elegant despite her circumstances, with eyes that had seen too much. "Thank you," the woman said quietly, "for showing us what the other side looks like." Sarah smiled. "The view gets better every day." As she drove home that evening, Sarah took a different route, one that passed by her old house. Robert had been forced to sell it months ago to pay legal fees. A new family lived there now. Children's bicycles littered the driveway, and bright curtains hung in the windows. She slowed down but didn't stop. There was no pain in seeing it, no regret, just a peaceful acknowledgement that life continued, transforming spaces just as it transformed people. When she arrived home, David was waiting on her doorstep with takeout and a bottle of wine. "How did it go?" he asked. "Beautifully," she replied, unlocking the door. "I think I found another piece of myself today." Later, as they sat on her balcony watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky, Sarah realized she had finally answered the question she'd asked herself all those months ago while staring at her reflection. Who is this woman? She was Sarah Williams, not defined by betrayal, not limited by loss, but expanded by her journey through both. She had learned that the heart's capacity to heal is just as powerful as its capacity to love, perhaps even more so. And as she leaned her head against David's shoulder, she understood that she hadn't just survived, she had transformed. The woman who had once sought validation in the approval of others now stood firmly in her own light, casting a glow that no shadow could diminish. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, noticing her contemplative silence. Sarah smiled, watching a shooting star trace its brief, brilliant path across the night sky. "I'm thinking that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one." And in that moment, under the vast canopy of stars, Sarah knew she had finally come home, not to a place, but to herself. The journey hadn't been what she expected, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. Complete, whole, free.